I didn't see him right away. I felt him. Not like love, more like static, something clinging to the air that didn't belong. A change in pressure. The way a room shifts before a storm rolls in. Before I tell you what happened the night my husband saw the truth, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me, is it ever okay to lie to protect a future you've already chosen? The ballroom was glowing. Soft string lights lined the ceiling like a constellation we rented by the hour. A jazz trio played something forgettable in the corner, and the crowd swayed politely with full glasses and empty conversations. I'd worn the green silk dress because Roman once said it looked like wealth. Not money. The idea of money. I was halfway through my speech when I felt it, that static behind the dessert table. Somewhere between thank you to our clients and this wouldn't have been possible without Roman, I knew he was here. Lel. Not because I saw him. Because for the first time in months, I felt a version of myself I'd buried rise back to the surface. The version who knew how he moved, how he stood, how he stared too long before asking anything at all. My voice didn't tremble. I looked out over the crowd and found every face but his. Roman stood beside me, hand firm on my lower back. We'd practiced this moment like a scene to Roman. My partner. In work and in life. I raised my glass. We clinked. And then, without hesitation, I leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't passion, it was punctuation. Like putting a seal on something that had already been opened. The crowd clapped. A woman in a navy wrap dress snapped a picture. Roman's cologne mixed with the citrusy note of champagne on my breath. And then a crash. The sound of glass shattering is always sharp, but in a room full of curated control, it's surgical. All heads turned. Mine didn't. I already knew. There he was. Behind the centerpiece. Thrift store blazer, name tag that didn't belong. Eyes wide, not with surprise, but with confirmation. And for once I didn't panic. Because I had already decided. This night was not his to interrupt. I turned back to the mic, let the silence swell just enough, and then I said it. Excuse me. That was my husband. The way the word dropped husband was almost theatrical. Not ex. Not friend. Not even Lel. Just husband. Like a footnote. Like a technicality I hadn't gotten around to erasing. The crowd laughed. A nervous, scattered kind of laughter. Someone raised a glass again. The jazz trio picked back up as if instructed. Roman smiled, kissed my temple. And the universe polished and decorated and rehearsed, resumed as if nothing had broken. But something had. Not in the room. In me. I stepped down from the stage. Not quickly. Not like someone escaping. Like someone returning to a seat that was never actually hers. People smiled at me as I passed. A man in a gray suit said, "Well done." A woman I'd coached last quarter gave me a soft nod, her eyes scanning Roman like a headline. No one looked at Lel. They didn't know who he was, or maybe they did and decided not to say anything. I spotted him again, by the far wall now, still holding a champagne flute like it might explain something. His tie was crooked, his shoes didn't shine. He didn't belong here and he knew it. But he didn't move. That was the part that surprised me. He didn't storm out or walk toward me. He just stayed. Frozen. Like if he waited long enough, someone would tell him this wasn't real. I made my way toward him. The air between us buzzed with something I didn't want to name. Roman kept mingling, oblivious or pretending. Each step I took clicked against the marble floor. The same way it used to sound in our kitchen when I came home late. Back when he'd wait at the counter with 2 mugs and too many questions. I never drank the tea, but I always answered, until I didn't. He didn't say anything when I stopped in front of him. I could feel everyone watching without looking. But it didn't matter. None of them would remember this moment the way he would. My voice was soft. Too soft for the room. Just for him. Did you really think this would end any other way? His jaw tensed. I knew that expression. I used to think it meant he was about to argue. Later I realized it just meant he was holding something in, like dignity. Or grief. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because for the first time since all of this began, I didn't care what he thought. I turned slightly enough to block the view of Roman behind me. Enough to remember what it felt like to be with someone who didn't expect me to perform. I brushed a strand of hair behind my ear. He flinched. Small but real. I wanted to ask him what he saw. If he still recognized me. If part of him had known long before tonight, but I didn't. Some truths don't need language. They settle in the space between two people and sit there undisturbed like sediment. The music swelled again. Someone near us laughed too loudly. A waiter passed offering truffles, and still we stood. The married couple no one remembered inviting. I could have said more. But what was left? That I remembered the way his hands used to tremble when he was nervous. That I noticed he'd worn the same watch I gave him on our 5th anniversary. That I hadn't really meant to leave the flash drive in the box number. Those weren't gifts. They were traps. And tonight wasn't for him. I stepped close enough to smell the detergent still clinging to his collar. He never liked strong scents. Roman, on the other hand, he wore cologne like armor. We stood less than a foot apart, but it felt like years. Years of shared calendars, of breakfast routines, of half-finished television shows and passwords I never changed. All undone in a single glance. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shocked. He was just finished. And, strangely, that made it easier. I tilted my head just slightly and smiled. Not out of cruelty. Not even pride. But because I realized something, he couldn't hurt me anymore. Not with silence. Not with forgiveness. Not even with the truth. Because I'd already told my version of it up there on stage, with the champagne and the spotlight and the crowd clapping like they understood. And if they didn't, that wasn't my concern. My story was never meant for everyone. Just for those who could read the spaces between applause. I stepped back. Not far. Just enough. He still hadn't spoken. And I respected that. There's a kind of dignity in knowing when words would only make things worse. I leaned in barely and whispered the last thing I ever said to him in a room full of strangers. You were always the quiet kind. But I never realized how loud your absence would feel. Then I turned. Not to run. Not to hide. Just to return. Back to Roman. Back to the performance. Back to the story I'd written myself into and couldn't quite climb out of. Behind me I heard nothing. No footsteps. No glass. Just the soft hum of a life splitting in half neatly silently. What shocked me wasn't that he came. It was that I wasn't afraid of him seeing it anymore. If you've ever stood in front of the truth and felt more clarity than shame, tell me below. Justice or too far, you decide. Before we move forward, I want to ask, if you had the chance to erase a life that no longer fit you, would you take it, or would you keep pretending until it broke on its own? I packed the box at 2:16 a.m. Not out of sentiment. Not out of rage. Just out of necessity. The house was too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't just settle, it creeps. Our kitchen still smelled faintly of ground coffee and fabric softener. The couch had an impression where he used to fall asleep mid-conversation. But the calendar on the fridge was blank. Empty squares. Like no one had planned anything after us. I folded the receipts first, ones I'd left in the console of my car or shoved in drawers. Dinner from that place with the chalkboard menu. A boutique lamp we never used. A ticket stub from a documentary Lel loved, and I forgot halfway through. Then came the bracelet. It wasn't expensive, but it clinked when I touched it like it didn't want to go. He gave it to me on a Tuesday, I think. No occasion. Just one of those you look tired days. Roman never noticed when I looked tired. He noticed when I looked expensive, and lately that mattered more. I hesitated with the photo. The one Lel had framed. We were at the lake house with friends. I was half laughing, holding a sparkler. He was kissing my cheek. He thought it captured joy. I thought it captured a lie. But I put it in the box anyway. Some things don't deserve to be kept, but they still don't deserve the trash. The box wasn't heavy. Cardboard taped on the sides worn from being in the attic too long. It looked like something you'd leave out on the curb, unlabeled, unclaimed. I didn't add a note. I didn't write from Aaron or please take care. He'd know what it was. He always knew when something was ending even if he didn't say it. By the time I carried it to the car, the sky was that strange dark blue where dawn tries to exist but doesn't quite win. I drove with the radio off. No music. No podcasts. Just the sound of the cardboard shifting in the back seat whenever I turned too sharply. His apartment building looked the same. Too beige. Too small. Too low. I didn't knock. I used the spare key. Yes, I still had it. I don't know why. Maybe I kept it like people keep birthday cards after the date has passed. Just long enough to remember they were once worth something. The door creaked when I opened it. He was sitting on the couch, back straight, like he hadn't moved in hours. There was a half-drunk glass of water on the table. An old blanket folded in the corner. He didn't say anything, neither did I. I walked in. Put the box on the coffee table. Right next to the remote I bought when ours broke. He still used it. Of course he did. Lel was the kind of man who didn't throw away things that still worked even if they reminded him of what didn't. I didn't sit down. That would have made it something else. A visit. A conversation. A chance. This wasn't that. I stood there while he looked at the box like it might bite him, and then he looked at me. Not with anger. Not even confusion. Just that same quiet gaze he always gave me when he didn't understand something but wasn't going to ask. It's all yours, I said. The account. The house key. Even the rest of the silence. His brow twitched barely. He reached forward slow, steady, and opened the box. First came the photo. His fingers hovered over it. He didn't lift it. Didn't flip it to see the forever written in my hand on the back. He just stared. Like he couldn't decide if it was proof of something real or a performance he hadn't noticed he was in. Then the bracelet. Then the receipts. He touched each thing like it might turn to ash. Finally, he saw the envelope. It was plain. Cream-colored. Unsealed. He slid it out. I watched his eyes flick from line to line. The joint account. The signed-over house deed. The notarized transfer of vehicle ownership. I had made sure every paper was clean. Legal, no questions. No mess. Except, I had forgotten one thing. The flash drive. It wasn't labeled. Wasn't even in a case. Just tucked between two folded papers like a bookmark you don't mean to keep. His fingers paused when he touched it. He looked at me then. Not sharply, not accusingly, just too long. Like the way you look at a drawer you know shouldn't be open. I said nothing. Because what could I say? I meant to take that. No, it's not what you think. It's just work. It's just one file. He didn't plug it in. Not yet. But he didn't put it down either. I felt something twist inside me. Not regret. Not guilt. Just recognition. This was the moment. Not the ballroom. Not the kiss. Not even the toast. This. Him holding something I never meant for him to find. And me realizing I might have left it there on purpose. Maybe I wanted him to know, not all of it, but enough. Enough to stop thinking of me as a question. Enough to finally see me as an answer he never wanted. He didn't say anything, just looked at the drive. Then back at me, and nodded. One slow, terrible nod. I almost said his name, almost. But the word stuck. Too heavy to lift, too small to carry what it once meant. I turned toward the door. My hand touched the knob. Cold. And that's when he asked. His voice was low. So quiet it didn't even feel like a question. Why him? I stood with my back to him, hand on the doorknob. Still. Why him? The question stayed in the air like perfume. Not sweet. Not welcome. Just lingering, long after it should have faded. I didn't answer right away. Because I didn't know how to say it in a way that wouldn't sound like cruelty, and maybe cruelty was all I had left. I turned halfway, not enough to face him. Just enough so the words wouldn't feel like they were thrown over my shoulder. Because you made me feel safe. The sentence sat there soft as velvet. But it wasn't a compliment, and safe stopped being enough. He didn't move, didn't breathe as far as I could tell, and I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing else to say that wouldn't unravel the whole thing. I wasn't ready to admit I'd done that already. I opened the door. A gust of cooler air slipped through from the hallway. It smelled like takeout from the neighbor's place, and cleaning fluid from the building manager's mop. Ordinary things, real things. Things I'd traded for something shinier, sharper, and entirely breakable. I stepped out, let the door start to close behind me. But I didn't pull it shut, didn't slam it, didn't even glance back. I just let it drift. And in that breath of space before the latch caught, I heard it. The box. The lid. That quiet scrape of cardboard against cardboard. The unmistakable sound of fingers lifting what should have stayed buried. The sound followed me down the hallway, down the elevator, into the parking lot. And hours later, as I sat in my car with the heater off and my hands curled tightly around the steering wheel, I realized something. It wasn't the kiss that undid us. It wasn't the flash drive. It wasn't even the lie. It was the moment he opened that box. And I didn't look back. I didn't look back when I left. But I heard the box lid open, and that sound has followed me ever since. The flash drive was supposed to be hidden. But maybe part of me wanted him to find it. When I taped it to the bottom of the folder, my hands didn't even shake. That should have scared me. It didn't. I told myself it was an oversight, that in the middle of sorting memories into a box of endings, I just forgot. But I didn't forget. I never forgot anything. What I did was decide. And sometimes a decision doesn't look like much. It looks like tape. A simple flap. A single breath held in your throat for half a second too long. A choice not labeled but meant to be read. It had been 2 days since I left the box. No calls, no messages, no fallout. The silence unnerved me. Not because I feared what he would say, but because I feared he had finally found a language I couldn't manipulate distance. The office felt different. Still smelled the same glass cleaner strong coffee and someone's overused vanilla hand cream. But the air carried a weight I didn't recognize. Like something had shifted just enough to throw off the balance of power. My desk was clean. Roman wasn't in. Or maybe he was avoiding me too. I opened my laptop, fingers hovering. Inbox 91 unread. Slack muted. The usual chaos. And then there it was. A text from a number I didn't save. But I knew who it was. I knew before I even opened it. You forgot what silence costs. See. 3 words. No greeting, no threat, just a debt. I stared at the screen, pulse steady. But somewhere beneath that calm, a cold needle began stitching a memory I hadn't let myself revisit. Chloe. The girl who had once copied everything I did. The one who laughed too hard at client jokes and color-coded everything even when no one asked her to. The assistant who showed up early, stayed late, and never asked for credit, only feedback. The last week she worked at Orion, she was pale, withdrawn. Still polite, still efficient, but something behind her eyes was missing. She signed something I handed her. Didn't ask what it was. A non-disclosure. A liability release. I don't remember which lie I used that day. But I remember her fingers shaking, just barely. And I remember walking away before they stopped. Back then, I didn't feel sorry. I felt clean. Like I had learned to streamline the mess. Now I wasn't so sure. I reached for my keys without thinking. No calendar ping. No coat, just movement. Impulse, panic in a silk blouse. Harding Avenue. It wasn't far. An old co-working space we used when Orion was still a dream and Roman still said things like we're going to change the way influence works. I hadn't been there in over a year. The lot was half empty. The door to the drop box still rusted on one hinge. I opened it. Nothing. No envelope, no note, no photograph, but the absence hit harder than any letter ever could. I wasn't being warned. I was being confirmed. She had it. Whatever Lel found, Chloe had known first. I stood there staring into an empty metal box. It was ridiculous, really. How something could feel so full, so weighted, just because it had nothing in it. I ran my fingers along the edge. Cool. Rough. Unremarkable. This was where Roman once dropped thank you notes to investors. Where I once left a birthday card for Chloe signed with flair I didn't mean. Now it was just a shell, like me. I walked back to the car, slowly unlocking it before I even reached the door. My hands were moving on autopilot. But my thoughts were sharp, too sharp. If Chloe had sent that message, it meant she wasn't afraid anymore. And that meant something worse. She had nothing left to lose. Not a job, not a reputation, not even the version of herself I let her build under my wing. She knew what was on the flash drive, not just the hotel footage, not just the registration forms with Lel's forged signature. She knew about the folder. The one labeled Phase 2 disengagement. The one I should have deleted months ago. And if she knew, then Lel knew. I felt the cold slide of something beneath my ribs. It wasn't panic. It wasn't guilt. It was exposure. Raw, unfiltered exposure. The kind that doesn't just burn, it silences. Back at my desk, the laptop screen had gone black. But my reflection lingered faintly. I looked tired. Not the kind Roman could fix with a new dress or dinner reservation. The kind Lel used to notice before I even said a word. And that's what undid me a little. I opened my voicemail app. I hadn't checked it in days. Most of the time, people didn't leave voicemails anymore. Too formal. Too final. But there it was. One new message. No name, no transcript. I pressed play. And Chloe's voice came through lower than I remembered. Steadier. He wasn't your mistake, Aaron. He was your last mask. And you dropped it. That was all. 10 seconds. No goodbye. No threat. Just truth. Pressed flat and mailed like a warning. Or maybe a gift. I sat back in my chair, eyes unfocused. Outside the window, people walked by with purpose. Meetings. Coffee runs. Life continuing like it always does. Inside, I couldn't tell if I was collapsing or finally shedding skin. For years, I controlled everything. Who said what, how things ended, what silence meant. But this wasn't mine anymore. Not the story, not the pace, not the narrative. Lel had the drive, Chloe had the message, and I had this chair, this view. This sudden awareness that being seen might be the one thing I couldn't orchestrate. Because they weren't looking at me like glass anymore. They were looking at me like someone who knew better and still chose the fire. I didn't leave the office that evening. Not right away. The building emptied slowly in predictable waves. Design team first. Then the junior account execs still pretending not to gossip in the elevators. Even the front desk light dimmed. But I stayed. The message looped in my head, not just the words, but the tone. Chloe didn't sound angry. She didn't even sound satisfied. She sounded like someone who had finally stepped outside of a house that had been burning behind her for years and only just realized the smoke had been hers all along. I closed my laptop but didn't shut it. I couldn't. Every part of me was tense like a thread pulled too tight across fabric that was already starting to fray. I'd built a life out of poise, charm, precision, and now every inch of it felt too delicate to hold its own weight. Roman hadn't called, which meant one of two things he didn't know yet. Or he did and was choosing the most Roman way to respond by letting me feel it alone. I used to admire that about him. The way he made silence feel like a strategy. Now it just felt like abandonment wearing a tailored suit. But it wasn't Roman, I feared. Not anymore. Not Lel either. He'd always been the kind of man who would rather hurt quietly than shout the truth. He would watch a building burn from the sidewalk instead of setting the fire himself. But Chloe, she had nothing left to protect. And I was starting to wonder if I did either. I stood and walked to the window. It overlooked the back parking lot. Yellow striped spaces. Half-lit security lights. Nothing extraordinary. But for a brief moment I imagined Chloe standing there. Watching. Waiting. Not to confront me, but to confirm that she'd finally made it out, and I hadn't. And that was when it hit me fully cleanly, like a pane of glass pulled loose from its frame. It wasn't Lel I was afraid of anymore. Not the man I married. Not the man I outgrew. Not the man I'd spent months quietly erasing. It was the version of me that no longer needed to lie. The one that Chloe had now seen. The one that Lel might be starting to understand. The one that could sit in silence and not flinch at the absence of applause. And maybe, just maybe, that's what terrified me most. Because once someone stops lying, they don't always become better. Sometimes they just become clear. And clarity. Clarity is harder to carry than guilt. What would you do if your entire life was built on charm and someone finally saw behind it? Would you run or rebuild? Tell me below. Before we keep going, I want to ask, have you ever made a decision so calculated, too, you didn't realize it would cost you your reflection? He found the folder. I didn't need a message to confirm it. The moment I opened my email that morning and saw a new thread titled Review Requested, Timeline Internal, I knew. Phase 2 disengagement from Leland Hayes, right there, in the subject line. Echoing like a bell I had once rung and forgotten to silence. It was the exact document I wrote 6 months earlier. A logistics plan. Clean language. Objective bullet points. No emotion. Just steps. A roadmap to distance. I called it strategy. Reading it now, it felt more like a slow execution. An erasure planned with precision. No blood, no bruises, just white space where a person used to be. He wasn't supposed to find it, but now he had. And worse, he'd shared it. I scrolled quickly. Nolan's name appeared, a consultant with forensic credentials. Hired supposedly to audit cross-client workflows. But I knew what he really was. He was Lel's scalpel. And he was cutting through everything I thought was invisible. I closed the laptop. The screen reflected my face, faintly tired, lined lips too tight. I didn't look like the woman who'd built Orion. I looked like someone Orion would drop. The room was dim. Not because the lights were off, but because I hadn't opened the blinds in days, just enough to work. Not enough to be seen. Then the next email came. Subject confidential, client withdrawal. Notice I didn't need to read the body. The name in the sender line was enough. One of our legacy accounts, 3 years, millions. Gone. By noon, another email. Then another. Small clients. Big ones. A soft unraveling, not loud enough to call a scandal, but steady, like watching a row of stitches come loose on a dress you sewed yourself. You know the moment it snags, but you pretend it won't spread. By 2:00 p.m., an HR memo landed. No subject. Just a line of text in the preview pane. We'll need a written statement regarding your operational oversight. They hadn't called me Aaron. They hadn't said thank you. They hadn't asked if I was okay. Just oversight, like a headline waiting to happen. Roman called at 3:17. He never calls during the day. Not since we agreed that optics are tighter when we stay publicly aligned but privately independent. I didn't answer on the first ring. I wanted to feel in control for at least 1 second. What did you do? He asked. Not even hello. You left fingerprints. Chloe has documents. Lel's team is making copies. There are phrases that match your language, Aaron. This isn't gossip anymore, it's evidence. I didn't reply. We had a firewall. You were the firewall. The call dropped. Or maybe I hung up, I don't remember. What I remember is opening my desk drawer and seeing the sealed envelope I'd ignored for weeks. The one Chloe mailed, not from anger but something worse. From confidence. I reached for it with fingers that didn't feel like mine. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, not because of what was inside, but because of everything I hadn't said when I first held it. I broke the seal slowly, not out of hesitation, but because part of me still believed there was time to make it not real. If I moved slowly enough, maybe the truth wouldn't catch. Inside were photos, not the scandalous kind. No blurred faces or hotel bedsheets or wine glasses captured mid-toast. These were colder, sharper, business casual. Contracts on marble counters. Handshake meetings with men I barely remembered. Smiles that had expired before the shutter clicked. One showed me leaning over a printed agreement Roman beside me. The man across the table was a former city council consultant, if I remembered correctly. He'd hired us to manage a PR disaster involving environmental violations. We helped him rebrand as a sustainability advocate in 6 weeks. The date on the photo was older than I expected. It was from the day I told Lel I was working late for a mentorship panel. I didn't feel guilty, I felt tired. Next, a notarized document, Chloe's name, my signature. Except it wasn't my signature. Not exactly. It had been copied, stylized. A forgery so clean it could have passed any audit. But I recognized the one detail that gave it away. I never closed the loop on my N. Chloe had. I scanned faster now. A list of internal language matches. Phrases like contained rupture, conflict aversion, mapping, empathy, framing. All phrases I used in client debriefs, then later in private conversations. Someone had been listening, recording, archiving. There was one final page. Handwritten. Titled Internal Mapping Draft, Phase 2. It wasn't Chloe's handwriting, it was mine. An early version of the disengagement plan. The margins were smudged from coffee. The paper folded in half then again. Old. Before the polish. Before Roman helped refine the tone. At the bottom a note to myself, when they stop asking questions, that's when you move. I dropped the page. It fluttered like a loose receipt but hit the floor like a weight. I leaned back in my chair. The walls felt smaller now. Or maybe I finally felt their shape. My phone buzzed again. Not Roman. Not Lel. Just a push notification from a business feed. Orion, Strategies faces quiet internal scrutiny amidst client reshuffling. Quiet. They always said I was the quiet one. The strategist. The one who didn't yell, didn't panic, didn't crack. But this wasn't a crack. It was a design flaw. Mine. And, for the first time I whispered aloud, I should have walked away at phase 1. The sound of my own voice startled me. Not because I said it, but because I said it like a fact. Like someone reading a sentence she didn't have to memorize. Because she wrote it. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I didn't tear anything up like they do in movies when a character realizes they've lost control. I just sat there. And let the weight of my own handwriting settle in my lap. It's strange the way destruction rarely feels like fire. More often it feels like stillness. A kind that doesn't warn you. It just arrives. My inbox kept blinking. Not urgent requests. Not reminders. Just echoes. Following up, revisiting last week's draft. Is now a good time? I didn't open any of them. Because somewhere between Chloe's envelope and the headline on my phone I understood something I had never been willing to name. Lel didn't destroy me. He didn't leak those documents. He didn't threaten me. He didn't drag my name into court, or send cease and desists, or storm into Orion demanding an audience. He just left, and that was enough. Because when someone disappears from your story without screaming, the silence they leave behind says everything you didn't prepare for. It echoed in the room. In the soft hum of my laptop. In the dusty corners of my apartment where Roman had stopped showing up and where Lel used to lean against the doorframe asking me what I wanted for dinner like it was the most complicated thing in the world. I opened the fridge. Half a bottle of white wine. A container of wilted salad. A note I wrote to myself 2 weeks ago. Client call. Be warm, not vague. I tossed the salad. Left the wine. There was nothing left I needed to drink to feel honest. My phone buzzed again. This time no name. No number, just a sentence that filled the screen. We're reviewing your past strategy files. Please stand by. No warmth, no closure, just process. The end wasn't explosive. It wasn't tragic. It wasn't even loud. It was methodical. One thread pulled. Another unknotted. A seam I once trusted now unraveling from the inside out. I stood by the window as the city dimmed. Headlights crawled down side streets. An ambulance passed siren off. Some lives end loud. Mine was ending. Politely. And yet, I had no one to blame but myself. This was the design I built. I chose every piece of it. Every partnership. Every silence. Every version of myself that smiled through betrayal and called it branding. The silence he left behind was louder than I expected. It echoed in every email I didn't answer. And it still does. Have you ever made something so perfect? It turned on you. Would you still call it your work? Or your regret? Let's talk. I didn't lose everything in one day. I lost it piece by piece exactly how I designed it. A client here, a contract there. A version of myself folded quietly into a drawer and replaced with someone cleaner, louder, easier to admire. Roman stopped calling. No goodbye, no threat, not even a headline. He simply vanished. And for a man who built his power on visibility that told me everything I needed to know. But then I heard Nolan's name. Not in a meeting, not in an email chain, in a podcast. One of those expose but make it palatable tech and ethics shows where everything feels neutral until you hear a word that belongs to you. They didn't say my name, but I recognized the shadow. They said a public relations firm currently undergoing quiet restructuring. They said a whistleblower who retained a forensic advisor with deep ties to both domestic and offshore record trails. And just like that I knew, Lel hadn't burned me. He'd simply told the truth quietly, patiently, in the exact language I once used to bury people. I didn't slam my laptop shut. I didn't delete my inbox. I just opened the drawer. The one with the old letters I never sent. The ones written in the hours between performance and collapse. The hours when I wasn't quite strong enough to leave but no longer kind enough to stay. There were 13. Some addressed L. Some didn't address anyone. Some started with sentences like, I didn't cheat out of lust. I cheated out of fatigue. Others simply said, I wanted to be seen as something other than yours. But the one I kept returning to, the one I had folded and unfolded so many times, the edges felt soft. Read, I used you to look normal. And maybe that was the most violent thing I ever did. I didn't even remember writing it. But I remembered how my hands shook when I placed it in the drawer. The only time I ever shook. Now I read it with still fingers. No emotion. Just clarity. That's what truth feels like when you stop needing it to save you. I hadn't planned to go. But one morning, with no meetings left to cancel and no names left to shield mine, I found myself driving west. I didn't check the weather. Didn't pack a proper coat. I just typed Asheville Trailhead into the GPS and let it guide me to wherever he now called stillness. It was almost poetic. The same hands that once drew strategy decks for Fortune 100 clients were now gripping the steering wheel, wondering what it would feel like to just see him. Not confront, not explain, just see. I parked at the edge of a gravel lot half hidden behind an overgrown patch of pine. He came into view just after 8 a.m. Wearing a light blue windbreaker, a baseball cap low over his eyes, and a backpack that looked borrowed from a simpler life. Lel looked smaller than I remembered, but not diminished, just softened. He wasn't on the phone, wasn't rushing, wasn't checking a mirror before stepping into the world. He walked like someone who had no one to impress and nothing to explain. It was strange watching him in motion while I sat perfectly still. Like observing the life you forfeited through double-paned glass. He paused at the start of the trail to adjust his shoelace. A woman jogged past him with a husky on a leash, nodding politely. He smiled. A quiet, genuine curve of the mouth that I hadn't seen in years, not even in old photos. My hand tightened around the steering wheel. I didn't cry. I didn't feel jealousy. What I felt was closer to awe. Like seeing a house you helped build still standing long after you walked away, but someone had painted it, filled it with warmth, made it new. He had rebuilt. And none of it had needed me. When he disappeared into the trees, I exhaled. A sound I didn't know I'd been holding. Back in my apartment, I opened my inbox for the last time. At the very top, subject: termination of advisory relationship from private client, redacted. The body was only one line. We've decided to sever ties. No reason, no signature. Just silence with punctuation. I didn't reply. I simply highlighted the email, clicked delete, and then opened the rest one by one, tracing the ghost of a career that had once fit me like armor. Until it didn't. I powered down the laptop, wrapped the cord neatly, and placed it in the drawer beside the letters. It felt like tucking away a language I no longer spoke. That night, I booked a cabin an hour outside the city. Just for a week. Just to breathe. No mirror. No phone, just me and the echo of what I used to call control. The cabin smelled like cedar and something older. Something like resignation. There was no Wi-Fi. No cable. Just a small kitchen, a creaky bed, and a window that framed the woods like a still life no one had asked to paint. I didn't unpack. I didn't write. I didn't even scroll. I just sat by the window with a chipped mug of black coffee and listened to the sounds of nothing. Of trees breathing. Of birds unbothered by legacy or exposure. Of the wind shifting through pine like it was clearing space for something new. And somewhere in that stillness, with a blanket around my shoulders and a notebook closed in my lap, the words came out before I could stop them. Out loud. To no one. To everything. He didn't burn me. He left the fire and I stayed in it. That was the truth, wasn't it? Lel didn't ruin me. He didn't shout or smear or twist the knife. He walked. And in doing so, he let the structure I built collapse in on itself. Because I never built a life. I built a performance. A facade with contracts and intimacy blurred in the same ink. And when the show ended, I stayed behind in the wreckage. Because I didn't know what I was without it. Now I still didn't know. But for the first time in years, I wasn't anyone's wife. I wasn't a curated asset. I wasn't a ghost in my own home. I was a woman sitting in a silent cabin. And that was enough for tonight. Have you ever had to watch someone heal from the hurt you caused? Did it break you? Or finally teach you who you really were? I kept one thing from everything that unraveled. Not the flash drive. Not the emails or the evidence or even the voice messages Chloe left me. Just a copy of the letter I never sent. It sat in the drawer of that rented cabin, tucked between 2 pages of a book I no longer remembered starting. The envelope had no name. But I knew exactly who it was for. Not Lel. Not Roman. Not Chloe or the clients or the version of me I curated for the world. It was for the girl I used to be. The one who stood in a hotel mirror 10 years ago fixing her lipstick before signing her first contract with Orion. The one who thought control was the same thing as respect. That morning in Asheville, I made tea in a chipped mug. There was no sugar, no lemon. Just water and leaves and steam rising in quiet spirals. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, the same one Lel once said made me look like a poet pretending to feel cold. He always saw me as more romantic than I ever earned. That was his gift. He imagined softness even when I offered sharp edges. I sat by the window. The trees were thick with spring green stretching toward a sky that hadn't yet decided whether it would rain. I opened the letter and began to read the words I'd never dared to send. To the woman I buried beneath strategy. You started this thinking you'd win. And, in a way, you did. You got the applause, the control, the illusion of invincibility. But what you didn't plan for was the silence. The kind that settles into your ribs and stays. I folded the page just once, then placed it gently beside the mug. I didn't need to rewrite it. Didn't need to sign my name. Some stories don't ask for response. They just want to be told. There's a kind of stillness that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like exposure. The kind you earn not because you seek it, but because there's nothing left to shield you. I had built my world out of leverage, and leverage only holds if everyone's afraid to speak first. But now no one was speaking. Not Roman, not the clients, not even Chloe. And that told me everything. Because silence has weight. It's not absence, it's consequence. I took my journal from the table. Not the leather-bound kind. Just a $1.99 spiral with a plastic cover and pages that curled slightly in the humidity. I liked how unimportant it looked. Unimportant things tell the most honest truths. I opened to a fresh page. This time I wasn't writing to Lal. I wasn't writing for Nolan or Chloe or anyone who ever watched my name climb up a boardroom slide. I was writing to myself. You used him, not cruelly, but entirely. You made him your backdrop, your credibility, your cover, your comfort, and you told yourself it was mutual. That safety was the same thing as love. It wasn't. He saw you like glass, and you mistook that for fragility. What he saw was light through you. What you became was shadow. I stopped. Not because I was done, but because for the first time I didn't need to explain myself anymore. There was nothing left to defend. Nothing left to spin. Only the truth, the version I'd hidden behind charm for far too long. The cabin creaked in the quiet. Not a threatening sound, just the wood settling like even it was letting go of the tension it once held. I reached for a match. Not to burn the letter. I wasn't here to destroy history. Just to heat the kettle. To make another cup of tea. To sit and sip and let the air smell like pine and smoke. To exist without strategy. No one came for me. No knock, no subpoena. No final word from Roman or Chloe or anyone else who once orbited the version of me I had spent a decade sculpting. And that strangely was the most honest ending I could imagine. I used to believe closure meant confrontation, a door slammed, a final argument, a reckoning with sound and fury. But what I found instead was air. Space. Silence. Not the kind that screams. The kind that breathes. Out on the porch, the trees shifted like old friends nodding at each other across distance. There were no fireworks, no grand unraveling. Just moss on the wood railing, damp earth, and the faint clink of my mug as I set it down beside me. I reached into the envelope Nolan had mailed a week prior. Inside, along with the copied files and paper trail of my own design, was one photo. Lel wearing a hiking shirt, smiling wide beneath a canopy of trees. Sweat on his brow, light in his eyes. No trace of me anywhere in the frame. On the back, Nolan had written in his familiar scrawl, "This is what rebuilding looks like." I didn't cry, I didn't ache. There was something almost sacred about being unnecessary to someone else's healing. I tucked the photo into my journal. Not as guilt, not as nostalgia, but as proof that something good had survived me. And then I did the simplest thing. I sat back, watched the wind move through the branches, and said aloud to no one at all, I wore the mask too well. And for God I had a face. It didn't echo. It didn't sting. It just existed like I did. For once not as wife or strategist or asset, just as a woman who had named the silence hers. I didn't tell this story for sympathy. I told it because if you're hiding behind charm, you should know it will cost you more than shame. If you've ever built a beautiful lie and watched it collapse, you're not alone. Subscribe to EN True Tales for more real stories of closure and quiet reckoning.